Afternoon, everyone. We're gonna start today's presentation. Today is our third part of our webinar series that we talked about migrating MIM to Entra ID. Today, we're going to focus a little bit more on the MIM Sync engine to Microsoft Entra ID. A couple weeks ago was the portal to Microsoft Entra ID. So today's agenda, MIM Sync versus Entra ID provisioning. What's the difference there? Then we're going to talk about the provisioning service that Microsoft Entra ID has. We'll talk a little bit about that and the different types of integrations with the service and the automations there. Then we're going to talk about some auditing and reporting and investigate the provisioning logs. We're going to do a final migration evolution of all the different slides that we had over the past couple weeks with the webinars and how MIM and Entra ID will look. And then we're going to do a quick review of the past couple webinars. So Oxford Computer Group, if you've never attended a webinar with Oxford Computer Group, wanted to point out we were just a finalist for 2025 for Identity Trailblazers with Microsoft. And some of the services we do provide, wanted to pick today, we're going to talk about identity strategy and roadmaps. We've been doing a good amount of them lately. It's a way to talk to OCG, and OCG can work with a company, a school for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks about their identity and security needs and get more of an envisioning session and roadmap going for them. But today we're going to talk about MIM Sync and how we can move that to Entra ID. So traditional MIM provisioning today, if you look at MIM, is really a hub and spoke type of service. So you have your sources of truth. They still currently can be a cloud source. You can still bring in Workday or some other cloud source HR system into MIM. You have a lot of people at this webinar probably have an on-premise HR source. That data does come into MIM, and then MIM will have rules set up to provision to different types of applications or directories. So I can provision to my Active Directory. I can provision to other applications on-prem. I might have a custom connector to a SaaS app. I might bypass Active Directory. I might provision right to Entra ID. Got some clients doing that now, so they're not using a sync process from AD to Entra ID, but it's really a hub and spoke. It does have that metaverse, if you know MIM, so it does have that record, and I can put rules against it and create my accounts as needed. So with Entra ID provisioning, it is a little different. There is a provisioning service we'll talk about, but it's more of a point-to-point solution. Data is queried from a source, and then users are searched in the configured application to find a match. If matched, the record will be updated in that application or destination directory. And if it's not matched, a new account will be created. So it's more of a point-to-point solution here. We'll explore more in detail how this works and what type of applications are supported in the upcoming slides here. So everything really is evolving around Microsoft, Entra ID provisioning service. If you haven't used it and if you're a little confused, I know when it first came out, it's really driving a lot of the different ways that accounts get provisioned to different systems now. It's the same thing under the covers. It's this Entra ID provisioning service. It's being used for your provisioning to Active Directory, to your Entra ID tenant. It's being used for your SaaS apps that you provision, and it's also being used for on-premise apps that you can provision to. All those we'll look at in different slides coming up. But the basics of this, is that the provisioning service, does use SCIM. the system for cross-domain identity management. The SCIM endpoint allows Microsoft Entra ID to programmatically create, update, and remove users for selected applications. The provisioning service can also create, update, and remove extra identity-related objects, such as groups. The SCIM-based provisioning connector is provided most applications in the gallery. So if you see an application in the gallery, it is going to be SCIM aware. But again, it also will be used for the on-premise Active Directory creation and Entra ID tenant user creation, but it is also being used for on-premises applications that uses a provisioning agent and translates that SCIM operations to LDAP, SQL REST, PowerShell, and even some of your custom connectors you've built in MIM, those EasyMA connectors. But every application that you do use do have basically the same UI and things that you do have to configure. So authorization, all the gallery apps will have different, credential types per gallery, and the tutorial will let you know. On-premise applications will use whatever it's connecting to, so it may be configured to use SQL security or LDAP security. But some of your other, your SaaS apps are going to use like a modern auth type of security with OAuth or OpenID Connect. You're always going to have a attribute mapping that you can utilize. Pre-configured and customizable. You'll get a pre-configured like schema that you can map. Of course, names, department titles, all those common default attributes that you usually map in an application are there. The key here is matching. We did say it's a point-to-point, so kind of like MIM when you join, you do have to have that unique identifier it's going to match in that source to target system. So it's going to import it, it's going to match it, it's going to see that it found something, it's going to update it. If it doesn't find it, it's going to create it. And then you have custom expressions. Custom expressions give you the ability to use more advanced rules for your updates to attributes in your target system. So you can create a custom expression similar to Entra ID Connect, where you have those sync rules. You can use those custom functions. It's very similar to that. Lots of different operators. The append, concatenate, join. So maybe you can create a custom display name based off of first name and last name, and even reiterating through it if it's a duplicate. So you do have to have a scope. You do have to have a way to know who you're going to provision. Assignment-based, you can use users, groups, nested groups you have to be careful with. The user needs to be in an immediate member of the group. So if you do have a group that's nested, the user does have to be in that immediate member. But now with Entra ID governance and some of our past webinars we talked about, you can now use lifecycle workflows to add a user to an application, or you can use an access package. You also have attribute-based scoping. That's more for your source of truth, inbound, Workday, SuccessFactors, which we'll take a look at. Those imports, you'll probably use an attribute-based scope there. So you could set it up so that you only want to provision users coming in to Active Directory if they're in a certain department, and that's what that scoping is utilized there for. And of course, this is a sync engine. It's in the cloud, and you do have provisioning cycles similar to what you have with Entra ID Connect. You do have your initial cycle, which is a full. Every time you do an initial, it is a full. Incremental, of course, after the initial is going to be an incremental. All your deltas will be synced. This is going to the target. Anything coming from a source, you're going to have to make sure that you do your fulls and your deltas that way. One thing to point out here is if you do want to have another initial or a full full sync, you do have the option to stop your provisioning service and restart it. So whenever it is restarted, it's going to do an initial sync. You will have errors. If anyone never had an error, that good for you. But there are going to be errors. But if there is an error in a target system for a specific user, for additions, updates, deletes, the it will be retried. So if you do see an error, it will constantly try to retry it, kind of like MIM. So if you do fix it, it'll eventually retry and it will correct itself. But there also is the idea now of quarantine. So if you have consistent failures, or maybe the service is down, the target service is down, or you have bad credentials, your sync cycle is going to go into a quarantine mode, and it's only going to sync once a day until it's fixed. So that's the Entra ID provisioning service. Those are the common things that you have to configure for the provisioning service. Now let's look at what it can provision to. Cloud HR provisioning has been around for a few years now. It started with Workday and Success Factors being an SAP product. It's more, I would say, like MIM than the next slide we're going to look at, but it's pulling data from that cloud app into the Entra ID provisioning service, and then it's going to talk to the provisioning agent that's on-prem, and that's going to be able to take those SCIM requests, translate it into a request to create the Active Directory account. And if you're in a hybrid mode right now, of course, Microsoft Entra Connect's going to sync the user up to your tenant. Once it's in a tenant, you also have the ability for these applications. They are enterprise applications in your tenant. So there's one for creating Active Directory accounts. There's one for creating Entra user tenant accounts. And there's one for writing back to that vendor. So there's a write back application to Workday and to SuccessFactors. So once you do get that person back in the tenant, you do have the option to export them with certain attributes. They are templates and they are only certain user attributes you can export to. So it is limited to that currently. So that's cloud HR provisioning, which didn't really help for, I would say, a lot of MIM users or environments, because not everyone had Workday. I know it's very popular now, but a lot of Workday clients didn't actually connect to their API. They were downloading or taking that data and putting it in SQL databases, or SuccessFactors, same thing. So what does everyone else do now? So within the past year, the next solution has gone GA. So I like to call it bring your own HR. So this is the inbound provisioning agent that Microsoft has provided now. So it allows you different ways to get your HR data into the Entra provisioning service. All the Microsoft Entra provisioning service, that's still going to stay the same. It's using the same thing that the Workday was using, that SuccessFactors was using. It's going to create your accounts, but now everything here on the left is something that you can utilize is to send information to the provisioning service. So there is now a provisioning API endpoint. You can take your data like a CSV file or a SQL database. You can read it, and you're going to use whatever tool you want. Logic app is a tool of choice out there, since it is a Entra ID cloud solution we could use. And there's pre-built templates in there that you can say, I'm taking this data, I'm gonna turn it into a bulk request JSON and send it to the provisioning API endpoint. But you could have different scenarios where you have other vendors creating this for you, some ISVs, and they'll be able to do that for you. So it could be in an out-of-the-box product that says, I'm going to connect to this database, and I'm going to send it to your provisioning API endpoint. So that really opens up everything now for us to move off of MIM because we had on-prem systems, and now we can send our data to our API endpoint. The third solution, it's been around again probably for a few years, but I know they've been adding to it. So this is where we have our legacy apps, and you're waiting to move things over, but we still have some legacy apps. We still need the provision to a MIM. So the HR provisioning was out there. That's great. We can create Active Directory accounts, but everyone's got everything else going out there. Some LDAP directories, some SQL databases. So this now allows you to create these applications in your tenant that can talk to the provisioning agent on-prem and provision out to these different types of applications. So I can now create accounts and groups in SQL, LDAP. It's going to utilize the provisioning agent and an EZMA host. These hosts are similar to what you see in MIM now. So if you had a custom EZMA management agent, there's pre-built ones like SQL, LDAP, PowerShell. That's been added recently. They're there. Or you could take your custom one and import it in to the host here. But it's similar to what you're doing in MIM. You install the provisioning agent, you configure your EZMA host, and it's going to connect to your target. But then if we look at number 3, I'm going to go back to my tenant, and that's how I'm going to configure the provisioning. Just how we saw in that first slide with the provisioning service. I'm going to, put authorization in there. I'm going to put my mappings in there. I'm going to put my scoping rules in there, and on all my different provisioning and deprovisioning logic. And that's going to take care of all your SCIM requests. And then the host understands that SCIM request and converts it to what it needs to for your on-prem application. So it could convert it to an LDAP request or a SQL request. And the last one, which is probably the first provisioning that we've had, is your SaaS apps. Yeah, this has probably been utilized for it's almost 10 years now, these SaaS apps, where you had the ability to use the provisioning service to automatically provision to your SaaS apps, your Salesforce, your ServiceNow, your Box, your Facebook. This was probably the original provisioning service that was being used. So all those SaaS apps have to be SCIM aware to be in the gallery. So if you don't know how to use one of these, every application does have a tutorial. So it is pretty easy to get up and running. So one of the big differences with Entra ID provisioning is logging. MIM, if you just use the sync engine, you really didn't have a way to log. You could look at the run cycles to see kind of what happened, but once you're once you imported back in your data back into the connector space, it kind of went away. You didn't have those pending exports. You didn't know what was going on as much. You kind of could investigate when something got created or updated, but didn't really give you too much logging. The MIM Portal tried to do it years ago with the MIM R2, but it really was not that adoptable because it had so much infrastructure you did need. So now with Microsoft Entra ID provisioning logs, it gives you a better idea of what's going on when you do provisioning. So you can find out when users from Workday were successfully created in Active Directory. What users were removed from Salesforce. What groups were created in ServiceNow. So now it gives you different ways to look at it with the identity, the display name of the source ID. It tells you the action, an update, create, delete. Tells you the target and the source system it's going to, and it's going to tell you the status. So those statuses are success, failure, skipped, and warning. One thing to point out with this skipped, you'll probably see a lot of skipped. If you're in there now doing any type of SaaS provisioning, you see skipped a lot because maybe something fell out of the scoping filter, so it's skipped. Or maybe a required attribute is missing on a person, so it's skipped. The common one there is like a matching attribute. I'm not gonna I'm not gonna do anything without my matching attribute, so it could be skipped. So if we dig down deeper into those provisioning logs, we can look at what steps were done during those that provisioning and deprovisioning process. So the steps are, import the object, um, then match the object. So I'm importing data from my target. I'm going to try to match it. If it's a match, we know it's an update. If it's not, um, it could be a create. Um, Determine if it's in scope. So it's going to look at those scoping rules. Is this person in scope? All right, I've gone past that. Now I'm going to provision. So we can see all these did pass. The other tabs are troubleshooting recommendations. If you do see some errors here, it's going to give you an idea, a descriptive error of what happened. And then it's going to tell you what was modified. You're going to see an old value and new value. So you might see that the department changed from sales to marketing. And then it's going to give you a summary. A lot of times, and if everything is checked off here, nothing's going to be in your troubleshooting and recommendations, but it gives you a good summary of what happened. All this data, if you do know Microsoft Entra, it's there for 30 days. If you want to export this to a CSV, it's easy enough to do. Provisioning logs can be in the different applications that you have, your SaaS applications, your creating Active Directory account application. It also, you can see them all in your main blade on your tenant in Entra ID. So all those can be exported to CSV, but if you really want to retain them longer and have a better solution and create some reports, you would have to turn on log analytics with Azure monitoring and some runbooks to make some fancier reports. That possibly would be a great webinar here down the road. So that is Entra ID provisioning, and we took a look at that, the different ways, the different applications we can provision to, and the different sources we can have now. They are, if you really look at it, almost unlimited now with that new solution with inbound API provisioning. But kind of the evolution that we've had over the series of the webinars is we kind of, from last or a couple weeks ago, we talked about moving everything to the portal. So we still had the sync engine here, but we did add that you can move a lot of your portal use cases to Entra ID governance. So we still are doing group management there. We're adding people to enterprise applications. We're doing some other workflows, which maybe, send some notifications. We're calling logic apps that do some custom workflows. And then we had group write back. So we can write back those groups to Active Directory. And that was maybe a phase one. Move your portal over, still use the sync engine. Today, we are starting to move away from the sync engine, and we have the ability to take our user source data. Rather than go to MIM Sync, we're going to go to our provisioning service. That's going to create our Active Directory account. That's going to sync up, and all of our Entra ID governance is still going to take place. Add people to groups, enterprise applications, but we still may have a few legacy apps. One more click here. So we may choose to import data back into our sync engine and still keep it running there to supply data to the legacy apps. Granted, maybe Active Directory doesn't have all that information, and we could add an arrow here to say, let's still get the source data into MIM so I can update my legacy app. But over time, I'm moving some of my legacy apps into enterprise applications, or they they have the ability to be managed from the provisioning service, the Entra ID Provisioning service. So that's where I'm going to add my on-prem support for SQL, LDAP, SCIM, uh, REST, any application I can connect to with that EZMA host. And that would eventually give those legacy apps a way to be removed, and eventually MIM Sync would go away. So that would give you I know it's not going to happen overnight. It's probably going to take a year or two, but that gives you the ability to move completely to Entra ID services. So, so we're going to recap our webinar series. It, the past two webinars and today, we started talking about the history of MIM, realizing that by the time MIM is retired in 2029, it will be 30 years old, as it started as a product that Microsoft bought back in 1999. So it is pretty amazing it's gone this long. We talked about the advantages of migrating off of MIM to Entra ID, that it gave you identity governance, it gave you the ability to, wire, you don't have to have on-prem servers anymore. You don't have to maintain SQL servers. There is a cost to that. Entra ID gives you much more flexibility to connect to different SaaS apps. All the logic apps out there can connect to thousands and thousands of applications. Our second webinar, we said, let's look at the MIM portal and those use cases and how can we move them to Entra ID. So we looked at common things like sending emails, self-service password reset, that can be moved. We looked at approvals. I have approvals in the portal. I can move that to Entra ID with access packages. We also looked at taking groups in Entra ID and writing it back to on-premise Active Directory. And we also looked at some of the custom workflows that we need to move over. That's where we said you can use logic apps, and logic apps can have the ability to do those custom workflows. And then finally today, we looked at user provisioning. So the portal has been moved. Maybe some strategies there. We'll move the portal first, and then we'll use our user provisioning over, and then we could have a final process or time that we're going to have legacy apps still on-prem that we need the sync engine to sit there for a while we modernize our apps and move them to our Entra ID tenant. So the first question here, what are the key factors influencing adoption and its timing? Other scenarios where Entra doesn't really reach full parity with MIM yet. What is the best practice in these cases? So again, that's going to be it's based off of the environment. Yeah, I could say some environments can be moved over from MIM to Entra, but there will be environments that have a lot of customization that doesn't really match to Entra ID, but there's always a solution. But whenever it's more custom in MIM, does it have to be custom in Entra? If it does, it's the same thing. If you really customize the MIM, you might have to do some customization in Entra. Customization meaning that you might have to bring in some other functionality from the Azure stack. The one thing obviously being is logic apps. You might have to have a logic app that's a little more advanced than just sending an email. Someone's wondering about the periodic attribute update management beyond provisioning, such as syncing title, department, etc. Of course, the Entra ID provisioning service does allow updates. So if your process to send to the API endpoint, or if you're using Workday and SuccessFactors, it'll have the ability to take those updates and sync it to it. One of the nice things is that you could have separate applications or in the tenant, you could have one that's syncing maybe certain attributes, and you're getting that maybe from an HR source that knows how to send that data. So rather than it being, scheduled. This could be, the whole process would have to be scheduled because you have to query your users, import it, send the bulk post update to the API, and it gets provisioned. That's going to be on a schedule, but that API, it's an API, it's listening. So if you had an application that could send out requests, it could be configured just for that application to send updates. So it's more dynamic. So when HR types in a new title for someone, it gets updated, it can send that and be updated automatically. So enforcement of stateful consistency appears to be coming, but what about things like precedence? Yes, precedence, I would say, is in that enterprise application. You would have to either consolidate if you have multiple sources of truth. You would have to consolidate to one record, and one of the ways you could do that would be on-prem, maybe taking both of those, if it's a database, and combine it into a view, segment your view out to maybe this data is from this source and this data is from that source. This one wins, so you'd have to make that up, design that yourself, or you can look into Azure Data Factory. OCG's been utilizing that. That's more of a cloud metaverse, so you can do precedence and transformations, consolidating multiple records into one with your precedence needs. Can groups also be synced to Entra ID? Kind of that can go different ways here. Of course, you can sync groups from on-prem to Entra ID. If it's talking about going through like a provisioning service, it's only the user object. You're not sending requests to create groups through the provisioning service, the Entra ID provisioning service, but you do have the ability, at looking at the last webinar, to create the group in Entra ID and provision it back to on-premise AD. And you also have the ability to provision groups, so a lot of SaaS apps and those on-premise apps using the EZMA connectors. So which capabilities can move over to Entra Connect? What do I need? What do I do about sources that still need to be synced but are not Entra connected? So I think we answered that with the new API inbound provisioning service. So if you do have any type of source that you needed to get into Entra, or provisioning to Active Directory, or an Entra user in general, you can have multiple API endpoints to update that user from different sources of truth. The first one here is about the identity governance license. It's very common. A lot of people, or orgs, schools, do have P1 or P2. So what we talked about today with the provisioning service is you need at least P1. So you can do that with P1. P2 does give you the ability to use access packages, but they can't be automated. So you could move over your portal experience where requesting apps or approvals, you can utilize that with a P2. So I do see customers moving their MIM. That's going to be the first phase, and then they're going to investigate identity governance. But identity governance does give you a lot out of the box now, and does enhance what because MIM really wasn't an identity governance product. The other question here we got, one underlying feature of MIM has been the connector space, that staging area, between a metaverse. I'm trying to grasp a difference in the diagram. Is there equivalent with Entra? And I guess it is a point-to-point. So you're gathering data from your source. It's going to that application. It's going to the provisioning source service. It's not storing the data somewhere like you mentioned here in the connector space and a metaverse. So it doesn't have that functionality, but I'm sure there will be vendors out there. I'm sure there will be an OCG thought on this, that as we do work with customers, we will create them a cloud metaverse so they can hold that data and build different rules about it. So there are ways you can do it, but the current provisioning service process does not store the data there and use it later. It's more dynamic. And I think that's the last question. Thank you for attending the webinar series for MIM to Entra ID. Hopefully it's been helpful. I know that if you have any other questions, I know we gather them sometimes and we have the ability to write you back. But again, thanks for attending. Have a great afternoon.